Alright, so for those of you watching this is me on about no sleep and even less caffeine. So I am not responsible for anything that I misspeak or misdo in this video. Also, I haven't timed the 1AC in quite a while, like since I wrote it for Ethos, so it's probably a few seconds over, and just deal with that. Let's get started. Senator Patrick Leahy once said, "Weapons that are inherently indiscriminate, whether by design or effect, should have no place in today's world. Because the United States and Russia perpetuate the use of immoral weaponry, we argue that the United States federal government should significantly reform its policy towards Russia." We're going to be talking about the issue of cluster munitions, so it would be prudent to define exactly what a cluster munition is. Carl Ching wrote in 2007 that essentially a cluster munition is a bomb with numerous smaller bombs inside. Cluster munitions are weapons that are designed to disperse numerous smaller explosive submunitions over a wide area. With our topic of discussion defined, let's examine how we'd ask you to judge the round. Inevitably, policymaking doesn't occur in a vacuum, but is the product of analysis through a given framework. The framework for this round is found in our goal of protecting human life. Fundamental to the very survival of humanity is the protection of the lives of its members. David Berube explained the devastating effects of ignoring human life in 1997. Quote, "When people become things, they become dispensable. Once dispensable, any and every atrocity can be justified. Once justified, they seem to become inevitable, for every epoch has its evil, and dehumanization is evil's most powerful weapon. If human life is disregarded in policymaking, all other concerns become secondary. Protecting the existence of humanity ought to be our primary concern in this round." With the framework established, let's move to analysis of the current system and our background point: massive stockpiles. While the problem of cluster munitions is indeed of global magnitude, over 100 other countries have signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions, a protocol that bans the use of these indiscriminate killers. Of the countries not party to the convention, Russia and the United States play a key role. So our A point here is Russia. According to Human Rights Watch in 2009, Russia has massive stockpiles of cluster munitions, and although official records are kept confidential, estimates place the Russian arsenal as containing hundreds of millions of cluster munitions. Unfortunately, Russia not only stockpiles them, it uses them. The 2008 conflict with Georgia, rebellions in Chechnya, and the 1980s war in Afghanistan all share a common theme of Russian cluster bomb devastation. The B point here is the United States. Historically the world's largest stockpiler, user, and manufacturer of cluster munitions, the United States stockpile of munitions holds between 700 million and 1 billion submunitions. By comparison, there are 3 submunitions for every 1 person in the United States. That's a frighteningly large payload of indiscriminately lethal ordnance. In addition, the United States has deployed cluster munitions in Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Grenada, Lebanon, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, and Afghanistan. The rest of the world has moved on the issue of cluster munitions. Russia and the United States are what you might call the big two, the 2 largest users and stockpilers left. It's time to end this resistance and uphold human life in our policymaking. Thus, we offer the plan text. Funding is the budget and agency is the federal government. The mandate is joint ratification. The U.S. will encourage Russia to jointly sign and ratify the Convention on Cluster Munitions. This convention bans the production, stockpiling, transfer, and use of cluster munitions. If the need for enforcement for Russian action arises, it'll come from economic incentives, namely the lifting of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment limiting U.S.-Russia bilateral trade, and enforcement for U.S. action will come from our government. Finally, let's move to examine the justifications for banning cluster munitions. Justification 1 is that cluster munitions are indiscriminate killers. That's indiscriminate killers. A weapon must be able to be controlled and only used as intended by its operator. Any lack of determination regarding the target of a munition turns the deploying weapon into an instrument of murder. The A point here is unguided ordnance. Civilians are cut down by cluster munitions on a scale unequaled by any other conventional weapon. The Harvard Human Rights Journal wrote in 2007 that cluster casings and submunitions cannot be controlled. Both are unguided and inaccurate. Many civilians die and still others receive horrific injuries from the razor-sharp shrapnel that spreads in every direction, unquote. Regarding the quantitative toll of cluster munitions, the Pace International Law Review documented in 2010 that research in 24 countries confirms at least 11,000 casualties, which translates to close to 100,000 casualties worldwide. Over 98% of casualties caused by cluster munitions were civilians. As tragic as civilian casualties are, though, there are times where such loss is the inevitable result of armed conflict. So the question must be posited. Are cluster munitions effective enough to outweigh the massive casualties that they inflict? And for the answer, we turn to the U.S. Armed Forces. Bonnie Doherty reported in 2007 that despite continued use of cluster munitions, the military utility of these weapons is declining. The 3rd Infantry Division called the ground-launched cluster munition a loser and asked if it had become a Cold War relic, unquote. The B point here is unexploded ordnance. While the initial deployment of cluster munitions has devastating effects on civilian population, the post-attack situation is even more devastating. The Pace International Law Review stated in 2010 that research in 24 countries confirms at least 75% of those casualties were due to unexploded submunitions. For civilians attempting to return to normal life, unexploded munitions pose an insurmountable barrier. Professor Thomas McConnell warned in 2002 that cluster ordnance becomes hidden killers, blending into their surroundings like landmines. One of the more typical cluster bomb accidents occurs in fields and gardens when villagers use hoes to prepare the soil for planting. The hidden submunitions have in effect created a minefield, unquote. Unfortunately, civilians aren't the only victims of munitions-turned landmines. U.S. military personnel are put at risk by this lethal ordnance. The Journal of Science and Engineering Ethics noted in 2010 that the U.S. Army suffered casualties due to unexploded cluster munitions on the order of 22 deaths and 58 injuries. This data appears to confirm that cluster bombs can be categorized as temporally indiscriminate weapons, unquote. Finally, the C point is life protected. Because at the point where we can eliminate a vast majority of the global cluster munitions, we exponentially better the lives of civilians around the world, and that's exactly what we do. Matthew Berger analyzed in 2010 that even with half of the world's countries on board, without the U.S.'s involvement, the treaty covers less than half of the world's cluster munitions. If the U.S. moved in, it would ban more than half of the cluster munitions used in the world, unquote. Our plan is better than 50%, though, because as we examined under inherency, Russia is second only to the United States as a stockpiler and manufacturer. When Russia ratifies the Convention on Cluster Munitions, all of those hundreds of millions of bombs will never be used. Our plan text removes the two biggest sources of indiscriminate murder via cluster munitions. That's a drastic improvement over the lethal current system. Finally, I leave you with the words of Professor T.A. Kavanaugh writing in 2010. Acceptance of the status quo suggests a callous indifference to unnecessary human suffering and a violent cynicism with regard to military ethics. As said of Napoleon's behavior on one occasion, it's more than wrong, it's stupid. To develop, manufacture, and use cluster munitions that result in such numerous, avoidable civilian casualties is unjust and it's foolish. For both reasons, it must stop. And that would be the 1AC. I'm open for cross-X, which I'm not exactly sure how we're going to do. But I'll let Isaiah figure that one out.